They said her father sold her to save a village, but no one told Lydia that the man they called a monster would never lay a hand on her, only on the walls around her. She entered that castle believing her freedom was gone, certain that the first night would be the last time she could truly call herself her own. Instead, a locked door became the beginning of a question she never expected to ask. What if the North's most feared king wasn't the danger, but the very thing standing between her and it? Before we go on, subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay tuned, because there are more kingdoms waiting, and more silences worth breaking. The village of Ashwell smelled of rain and wood smoke on the morning everything changed for Lydia. She moved through the narrow streets with a basket balanced against her hip, stopping to press fresh bread into an old widow's hands, before kneeling to tie a little boy's torn shoe without being asked. Everyone in the village knew her as the woman who always noticed those everyone else overlooked. At home, her father lay wrapped beneath worn blankets, weakened by illness after 2 winters of failed harvests. Before sunrise, she worked the fields. After sunset, she cared for him. She never complained. She simply carried burdens that had quietly become too heavy for one person. No one in Ashwell had ever tried to save Lydia, because everyone believed she was the one who always saved everyone else. The knock came just after dusk, sharp enough to silence the tiny cottage. 3 representatives of the Royal Debt Guild entered carrying ledgers instead of weapons, but their presence felt no less frightening. The harvests had failed twice, they explained calmly, and the family's debt had reached the crown. Under the kingdom's ancient laws, families who could no longer repay what they owed could surrender years of bonded service instead of losing their land, or condemning the entire village to ruin. Wealthy nobles often purchased those contracts, gaining loyal servants for years. Some masters treated them fairly, others did not. Lydia stood motionless beside the hearth as the figures were read aloud, watching her father's hands begin to tremble. When the men finally left, neither of them spoke. The silence hurt more than the numbers ever could. By sunrise, the entire village was whispering about the northern castle. Rumor spread quickly that the debt contract had attracted an unexpected buyer, the most feared Alpha King in the kingdom. No one understood why he had become involved. The Alpha King almost never purchased debt contracts. He rarely involved himself in the affairs of ordinary villagers at all, yet somehow, this time, he had made the highest offer before anyone else could. Around Ashwell, people lowered their voices whenever they spoke his name. Some claimed he ruled with ruthless discipline, others insisted no one had ever seen him smile. The oldest villagers simply crossed themselves and warned their children never to travel north after dark. Lydia listened in silence, trying not to imagine the man waiting at the end of that road. Her father finally confessed the truth that afternoon. The Alpha King's payment would erase not only their family's debt, but every outstanding debt hanging over Ashwell. Dozens of families would keep their homes. Children would have food through the winter. The village itself would survive. But the agreement required Lydia to enter the Alpha King's household under the bonded service contract. Tears filled her father's eyes before he could finish speaking. "I never wanted this," he whispered, unable to meet her gaze. Lydia knelt beside him and gently took his shaking hands into hers. She didn't blame him. She knew what desperation looked like because she had lived beside it for years. "If my leaving saves everyone," she said softly, "then it's not a sacrifice I'll regret." She spoke with calm certainty, though deep inside, fear had already begun quietly rewriting every dream she had ever imagined for herself. The journey north lasted 2 days, each mile carrying her farther from the only home she had ever known. The castle appeared through the mountain mist like something carved from legend itself, dark stone walls rising above the cliffs, banners snapping against the winter wind. Servants received her with quiet courtesy, though many avoided looking directly into her eyes. One elderly housekeeper gently draped a thick wool cloak across Lydia's shoulders without saying a word, her expression carrying the quiet sadness of someone who understood far more than she was willing to explain. The castle felt strangely peaceful, yet beneath that silence lingered something impossible to read. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something. Lydia only wished she knew what. The towering doors of the great hall slowly opened before her. At the far end of the chamber sat the Alpha King upon a simple stone throne, dressed in black medieval armor, beneath a magnificent dark wolf fur cloak. Broad-shouldered, silent, with piercing grey eyes that seemed capable of seeing far beyond appearances, he watched her approach without a single trace of cruelty upon his face. That unsettled her more than anger ever could have. The advisors lining the hall shifted expectantly, clearly waiting for him to announce the terms of her service. Lydia steadied her breathing and prepared herself for whatever future awaited. The Alpha King rose, descended the long staircase, stopped a few feet before her, and after a long silence, simply turned toward the head servant. "Prepare the east chamber for Lady Lydia." Silence swept across the great hall. Even his own advisors looked at one another in complete confusion. The room prepared for Lydia was nothing like the prison she had imagined during the journey north. It wasn't luxurious, but it was warm, quiet, and carefully arranged. A fire burned gently in the hearth. Clean linen covered the bed. Fresh bread and hot tea waited on a small wooden table beside the window. Everything felt strangely thoughtful. She sat awake for hours, unable to bring herself to lie down completely, listening to every distant footstep in the corridor. Surely the Alpha King would come eventually. Every story she'd ever heard ended the same way, with the master claiming what now belonged to him. She waited until the fire burned low, and exhaustion finally closed her eyes before fear could. Morning arrived with pale winter light spilling across the wooden floor. A young servant girl entered carrying breakfast, smiling politely before placing the tray on the table. Lydia gathered her courage and quietly asked the question that had followed her through the entire night. "Will His Majesty be sending for me?" The girl hesitated just long enough to reveal there was something unusual about the question. "His Majesty gave only 3 orders," she answered softly. "No one enters your room without his permission. No one is allowed to speak harshly to you. And if you ever wish to leave the castle grounds, you only need to tell him." Lydia frowned in confusion. Those weren't the rules of a prisoner, nor were they the privileges of an honored guest. She couldn't understand what she had become. The days passed quietly, and little by little Lydia began exploring the castle. She wandered through long stone corridors, peaceful gardens resting beneath the first frost, and kitchens filled with the comforting smell of fresh bread. Everywhere she went, the servants greeted her kindly. One afternoon she helped an elderly cook carry heavy pots without being asked. Another morning she spent an hour comforting a frightened stable boy whose horse had fallen ill. She couldn't stop herself from helping people. It was simply who she was. In return, she noticed something unexpected. Every servant spoke of the Alpha King with quiet respect instead of fear. An old gardener smiled while trimming winter roses and said, "When the avalanche destroyed my cottage 3 winters ago, His Majesty rebuilt it before rebuilding part of the castle." Lydia looked at him in surprise. That wasn't the kind of story anyone in Ashwell had ever told. She saw the Alpha King properly for the first time 4 days later. He was crossing a gallery lined with ancient portraits, dressed in black armor beneath the great wolf-fur cloak she had heard described so many times as a child. Tall, broad-shouldered, impossibly composed. He stopped the instant he noticed her standing alone. For 3 long seconds neither of them moved. His grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heartbeat stumble, as though he were searching her face for something only he could see. Then a servant accidentally brushed against Lydia, causing a heavy book to slip from her hands onto the stone floor. Before she could bend to retrieve it, the Alpha King stepped forward, picked it up himself, and silently placed it back into her hands. His fingers never touched hers, not even by accident. He gave the smallest respectful nod before turning and walking away without another word. The same strange pattern repeated itself over the following days. Sometimes she caught him watching her from across the gardens. Sometimes she noticed him quietly listening while servants laughed at something she'd said in the kitchens. Whenever they crossed paths, he acknowledged her politely, spoke only when necessary, and always kept a careful distance between them. It wasn't avoidance born from dislike. Lydia knew that feeling too well. This was something else entirely, a deliberate restraint, as though every step closer required more strength than walking away. She began noticing things others ignored. The way his jaw tightened whenever someone mentioned her name, the way his expression softened for the briefest moment before discipline erased it again. Whatever burden the Alpha King carried, it seemed to have her at its center. That evening, unable to quiet her thoughts, Lydia wandered through an empty corridor until she stopped before a large portrait hidden beneath a heavy velvet cloth. She reached toward it instinctively, curious why such a beautiful frame would remain covered. Before her fingers touched the fabric, the same young servant hurried toward her, gently lowering her hand. "Please, no one is allowed to uncover that painting." she whispered nervously before quickly changing the subject. Lydia looked once more at the hidden portrait, then back toward the dark hallway where the Alpha King had disappeared only minutes before. She closed her eyes, replaying every silent glance, every unanswered question, every impossible act of kindness. The most feared Alpha King in the kingdom had bought her freedom, refused to touch her, and looked at her as though losing her would break something inside him. Lydia no longer feared the man everyone had warned her about. What frightened her now was the growing feeling that none of those stories had ever been true. The castle infirmary became Lydia's refuge almost by accident. Hidden in the quiet eastern wing, it smelled of dried herbs, clean linen, and old wood warmed by the afternoon sun. She first entered only to ask for fresh bandages after helping a stable boy scrape his arm, but within minutes she was assisting an exhausted healer whose hands were already full. No one asked her to stay. She simply did. Before sunset, she had prepared medicine for 3 elderly soldiers, read letters aloud to a wounded guard who could no longer see clearly, and convinced a frightened little boy that broken bones healed much faster after a good laugh. Helping people had never been something Lydia chose to do. It was simply the way she knew how to exist. The people of the castle began speaking about her in ways she never expected. Servants smiled when she entered a room. Guards who rarely spoke to anyone greeted her by name. Even the stern head healer, Lady Marin, finally folded her arms and shook her head with reluctant admiration. Most people who arrive through a debt contract spend weeks mourning the life they lost, she said. You spend every day trying to make someone else's life easier. Lydia smiled faintly while folding fresh bandages. Pain feels lighter when nobody has to carry it alone. Marin studied her for a long moment before quietly answering, Perhaps that's why His Majesty hasn't stopped watching you. Lydia looked up in surprise, but Marin had already returned to her work as though she hadn't spoken at all. Curious now, Lydia became more aware of the strange feeling that had followed her since arriving. Every so often she sensed familiar grey eyes resting on her from a distant balcony, an open doorway, the far side of the gardens. The Alpha King never interrupted her. He never approached. He simply watched in complete silence before disappearing again. She couldn't understand it. If she truly belonged to him, why did he remain farther away than anyone else in the castle? That afternoon, while returning borrowed medical books to the old library, Lydia wandered into a forgotten corridor where dust covered everything except a single portrait hanging proudly between 2 ancient banners. The woman in the painting looked astonishingly familiar. Long, dark hair, calm brown eyes, a quiet strength resting in her expression instead of pride. Lydia stepped closer without realizing she had stopped breathing. She looks, she whispered to herself, like family. She was my mother. The voice behind her was so calm it startled her more than a shout would have. She turned to find the Alpha King standing only a few steps away. For the first time since she'd arrived, there was no distance between them. Neither of them spoke for several heartbeats. Lydia looked back at the portrait before quietly asking, "Is that why you brought me here?" The question lingered between them. He stared at the painting instead of answering, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "No," he said at last. "You remind me of her." His voice carried a grief so old it sounded like part of the castle itself. "But that's not why I chose you." Before Lydia could ask another question, he stepped away, stopping only long enough to add, "Some memories are harder to explain than to survive." Then he disappeared into the corridor, leaving Lydia staring at the portrait with more questions than answers. Late that evening, unable to quiet her thoughts, Lydia crossed the kitchens in search of tea and paused when she heard 2 senior advisors speaking in hushed voices beyond the doorway. "He's making the same mistake again," one whispered. "If he tells her the truth now, he'll lose her." The second man sighed heavily. He already knew that the day he signed the contract. Lydia's heart pounded so loudly she barely heard the rest. One thing had suddenly become clear. The Alpha King hadn't brought her to the castle by impulse. Whatever secret everyone seemed determined to protect had begun long before she ever arrived in the north. Lydia barely slept after overhearing the advisors in the kitchen, their unfinished words following her through every silent hour of the night. By dawn, she had made up her mind. She was done chasing whispers through castle corridors. If the truth existed, she would find it herself. Fortune seemed to answer that decision when she discovered Corwin, an old merchant from Ashwell, unloading grain in the castle courtyard. He had known her father for years, long before sickness and debt had hollowed the man into someone Lydia barely recognized. The moment she asked about the auction, the warmth disappeared from his face. He looked at her with quiet sorrow, as though he'd hoped she would never have to learn what had really happened. "Your father never sold you for money," Corwin said gently. By the time those contracts reached the moneylenders, the decision was already out of his hands. He explained that the failed harvests had pushed nearly every family in Ashwell into impossible debt. Within days, every unpaid contract was scheduled to be transferred to men who trafficked entire villages across the northern border. Mothers, children, elderly parents. No one would have been spared. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face as Corwin continued. 3 days before the auction, the Alpha King quietly bought every single debt himself. He wasn't finished. He also ordered that no collector, no guard, and no buyer was allowed to touch a single family until every contract had been transferred to the crown. Lydia could only stare at him. The auction she believed had sealed her fate had never truly been about selling people. It had been the only way to rescue them without exposing the king's plan. She found Kyle that evening exactly where she somehow knew he would be, alone in the library, surrounded by ledgers and candlelight. He looked up the instant she entered. Before she could organize the 1,000 questions inside her mind, only one escaped her lips. Why? The single word lingered between them. He understood immediately what she was asking. Slowly, he closed the ledger before him and released a quiet breath that sounded far older than the man standing before her. "Because I couldn't let history happen twice." For a long moment, he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the fire instead of her. "I was 12, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I watched men come to our home with contracts that looked perfectly legal." His jaw tightened. "They said my mother belonged to them now." He swallowed once before continuing. "I watched them take her away while I stood there too young to stop them." The room seemed smaller somehow, every word pressing heavier against the walls. "I never saw her again." He looked down at his hands for a long moment before lifting his eyes to hers. "The advisors you overheard, Baron and Tessa, they were her closest friends. They helped raise me afterward, and the day I became king, I made them one promise." His voice hardened with quiet conviction. "No woman would ever disappear behind another debt, while I still had the power to stop it." Tears blurred Lydia's vision as every unanswered question finally found its place. "So, you never bought me," she whispered. "You saved me." Kyle held her gaze without looking away. "The day your name appeared on that list," he said quietly, "you stopped being a debt." He stepped a little closer, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "You became my responsibility." A long silence settled between them before he spoke again, softer this time. "Somewhere along the way," he paused, almost as though the next words frightened him more than any battlefield ever had. "You became much more than that." Neither of them moved. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt fragile, precious. Lydia finally understood why he had never entered her room, never demanded anything from her, never treated her like something he owned. He had been protecting her from the very fate he had spent his entire life trying to erase. But one question still refused to leave her heart. If freedom had always been waiting beyond the castle gates, why did the Alpha King look terrified every single time she spoke about leaving? The morning after his confession, Lydia woke before sunrise with a quiet certainty she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since leaving Ashwell, no one expected anything from her. She owed no debt. She belonged to no contract. The castle gates stood open if she wished to leave, and no one would stop her. Yet instead of packing the small bag she'd arrived with, she found herself walking toward the infirmary once again. The soldiers greeted her with tired smiles. The children ran to meet her before she'd crossed the courtyard. Marin handed her another stack of bandages without saying a word, as though Lydia had always belonged there. Staying was no longer something done out of gratitude or necessity. It was a choice, entirely her own. And somehow, that simple realization made the castle feel less like a prison and more like the first place that had ever truly welcomed her. The days that followed quietly transformed the kingdom in ways no royal decree ever could. Lydia organized food deliveries for widows forgotten after the last harvest, convinced retired soldiers to teach orphaned children useful trades, and turned an abandoned sewing room into a place where young girls learned to read instead of waiting for someone else to decide their future. None of it carried her name. She never asked for recognition, yet the stories spread anyway. Farmers spoke of the woman who remembered every face. Mothers whispered about warm bread appearing on their tables during the coldest mornings. Even the servants began smiling more easily whenever she passed. Long before any crown touched her head, the people had already begun calling her something the council still refused to say aloud: their Luna. Kyle watched it happen from a distance longer than he should have. Every instinct told him to stay away, afraid that his presence would only complicate the fragile freedom she'd finally regained. More than once he started walking toward her, only to turn back before she noticed. He had promised himself that saving her would never become another kind of prison. If she chose to leave, he would bear it. Some nights he stood alone on the highest tower, watching the road that led away from the castle, wondering whether tomorrow would be the day she finally disappeared from his life forever. The thought hurt more than he had ever imagined possible. He found her one evening standing on the eastern balcony, watching the sunset wash the valleys below in gold. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "You changed this place," he said quietly. Lydia smiled without taking her eyes off the horizon. "No," she answered. "The people here were always good. They simply needed someone to remind them." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and all the careful walls he'd carried for years suddenly felt exhausting. "When I paid your family's debt," he admitted, "I believed I was rescuing a stranger." His voice lowered. "I never imagined she would become the person my kingdom needed, or the person I would never want to lose." The words settled gently between them, carried away only by the evening wind. Lydia turned to face him, her heart impossibly calm now. "Do you know when I stopped being afraid of you?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "The first night." His eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. She smiled. "The moment you gave me a room instead of treating me like something you had bought." She reached for his hand before he could answer, her fingers slipping naturally into his. "That was the moment I realized everyone else had been wrong about you." Kyle closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by a relief he hadn't allowed himself to hope for. For several quiet seconds they simply stood there, hand in hand, watching the lights of the kingdom flicker to life below them. At last Kyle spoke, his voice rough with the only fear that still remained. "If you choose to leave tomorrow," he said, "I'll have the gates open before sunrise." Lydia looked at him for a long moment, searching the face of the man who had spent his entire life giving freedom to everyone except himself. Then, instead of answering with words, she stepped closer until there was no distance left between them. "I'm staying," she whispered, "not because you saved me." Her fingers tightened gently around his hand. "Because, for the first time in my life, I've found somewhere and someone I want to choose." Above them, unnoticed by either of them, the first bell announcing the emergency meeting of the Royal Council echoed across the castle, warning that their greatest battle was only just beginning. Dawn broke pale and gold across the northern mountains, and Lydia walked toward the castle gates with a calm she had never known before. Beyond them waited the road back to Ashwell, the small village she had believed she would never see again. Kyle was already there exactly as he had promised, one horse saddled beside him, the reins resting loosely in his hand. He had kept every word he had given her. The gates stood open. No guards blocked the road. No chains remained except the ones fear had forged inside their own hearts. He looked at her quietly, every part of him prepared to lose the one person he had spent weeks trying so desperately not to imprison with gratitude. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Lydia noticed everything she had learned to read about him, the stiffness in his shoulders, the exhaustion hidden beneath his calm expression, the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the leather reins before relaxing again. He was forcing himself not to hope. He would watch her leave if that was what she wanted, because loving her meant protecting her freedom even when it broke his own heart. No one had ever offered Lydia something so precious before. Her entire life had been filled with people deciding her future for her. This man was the first to place her future back into her own hands. Instead of reaching for the horse, Lydia stepped toward him. Slowly, deliberately, she slipped her hand into his. His breath caught almost invisibly, as though even now he feared this might disappear if he moved too quickly. "You're not leaving," he whispered, unable to hide the hope in his voice any longer. Lydia smiled through tears she no longer tried to hide. "No," she answered softly. because this is the first place I've ever stayed, simply because my heart wanted to. Around them, servants, soldiers, healers, stable boys, widows from the nearby village, and even the children Lydia had taught, slowly gathered in the courtyard, drawn by the quiet certainty that something unforgettable was happening. No royal announcement had summoned them. They had come because kindness always leaves witnesses behind. One by one, voices began to rise from the crowd. "Our Luna!" Then another. "Our Luna!" Soon the entire courtyard echoed with the same words, until even the ancient castle walls seemed to answer them back. The council could write laws, but the people had already chosen. Kyle looked at the crowd before turning back to Lydia. Then, for the first time in his life, the Alpha King did something no ruler before him had ever done. He didn't place a crown upon her head. He didn't claim her hand because tradition allowed it. Instead, he stepped back half a pace and asked the only question that truly mattered. "Lydia," his voice was quiet enough that only she heard the emotion inside it, "will you choose to stand beside me?" The courtyard fell completely silent. Lydia looked into the eyes of the man who had bought an entire village, only to save strangers, who had protected her without asking for anything in return, who had loved her long before daring to hope she might love him back. "I choose you," she answered. Only then did Kyle lift the Luna's crown. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he placed it gently upon her head, not as a reward, not as a payment, not as the end of a bargain, but as the visible promise of a choice freely given. The courtyard erupted into applause, but neither of them seemed to hear it. The man who had spent his life rescuing others had finally allowed someone to rescue him too. He had purchased a woman's freedom expecting nothing in return. Instead, he received the only gift that can never be bought, a heart that chose him back. Under the same moon that once watched a frightened girl walk through castle gates believing her freedom had ended, a Luna now stands beside the king, who taught her that love was never meant to be taken, only offered and chosen again and again. The village of Ashwell still remembers the debt that nearly broke it, and the man who quietly erased it without ever asking for gratitude in return. Somewhere in that castle, an old portrait still hangs behind faded tapestries, no longer a wound hidden in shadow, but a reminder that even the deepest grief can soften into something worth protecting. Kindness, it turns out, was never the weakness the world tried to convince her it was. It was the very thing that finally set two broken hearts free. Maybe you've felt invisible before, overlooked, substitutable, the one everyone leaned on but no one thought to save. Maybe you've wondered quietly if you were ever truly someone's choice, or simply someone's convenience. If Lydia's story stirred something in you, know this: even the coldest hearts can learn to choose. Even the most feared kings can learn to ask, instead of take. So if forbidden bonds, alpha kings, and women who found their freedom in the last place they expected are stories that live in your heart too, subscribe, turn on your notifications, and stay close. Because under this same moon, there are still more stories waiting for you.